Honestly, you'd think they'd have better things to do than just linger. The words, spoken in a low conspiratorial whisper that was intended to be heard, dripped with the kind of casual disdain that felt ancient and practiced. Carolyn Peterson adjusted the silk scarf at her neck, her eyes flicking dismissively towards the young black woman standing by the reception desk. Some people just don't understand where they belong. Little did Carolyn know she was about to receive a masterclass in jurisdiction, not from the police or a dealership manager, but from a mother whose place was in a world Carolyn couldn't possibly comprehend. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the first tremor of an earthquake that would shatter her perfectly curated life. The air inside Prestige Motors was sterile, smelling of expensive leather cleaner and ambition. 17-year-old Lena Washington breathed it in, feeling a mix of excitement and intimidation. For her 18th birthday, her mother had promised her a car, a reliable, safe-used car, but her mum, ever thorough, had insisted they start their search at a high-end dealership, not to buy, but to establish a baseline for safety features. Imani, an aspiring graphic designer with a sketchbook full of vibrant, swirling art, felt out of place among the gleaming chrome and polished mahogany. She wore her favorite jeans, a clean but well-loved hoodie from her high school's art club, and a pair of colorful sneakers. She was keenly aware of the contrast she presented against the muted tones of quiet wealth that surrounded her. A salesman named Greg, whose smile seemed as polished and superficial as the floor, was fawning over a woman named Carolyn Peterson. Carolyn was the living embodiment of old money, from her perfectly coiffed blonde hair to her discreetly expensive loafers. She was considering the new flagship sedan, a behemoth of German engineering that cost more than Imani's future college tuition. "And the passenger-side ergonomics are simply divine," Greg was saying. "The seat adjusts in 16 different ways. Here, let me show you." Carolyn waved a dismissive hand. "I won't be sitting there, will I? My husband, Richard, is tall, but I need to know it's comfortable for guests." She scanned the showroom, her gaze landing on Imani. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed her face before she plastered on a syrupy sweet smile. "You," she called out, her voice carrying across the showroom. "Young lady, come here for a moment." Imani looked up, startled. She pointed a finger at her own chest. "Me, yes you. Come on, don't be shy." Carolyn beckoned her over, as if summoning a servant. "Greg needs someone to sit in the passenger seat to demonstrate the features. You can help us, can't you?" Imani hesitated, glancing at Greg, who gave her a strained but encouraging nod. It felt strange, like being asked to be a living prop. Still not wanting to cause a scene, she walked over. Sure, okay." She slid into the passenger seat, the leather cool against her skin. The car smelled new and intoxicating. "It's nice," she murmured. "Just sit normally." Carolyn instructed, her tone sharp and impatient. "Greg, show me the lumbar support." Greg fiddled with the controls on the door, and the seat began to whir and shift around Imani. She sat stiffly, feeling dozens of tiny motors adjusting beneath her. After a few minutes of this, Carolyn seemed satisfied with the seat itself and turned her attention to the dashboard. "And all the safety features are top of the line, I presume?" she asked Greg. "The best in the industry, Mrs. Peterson," he chirped. 10 airbags, lane assist, automatic braking, and a state-of-the-art passenger restraint system. As Imani shifted slightly to get more comfortable, a small, insistent beep sounded, and a red icon of a person with a seatbelt flashed on the massive digital dashboard. Carolyn's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Greg leaned in, his smile faltering. "Oh, that's just the seatbelt sensor." "Mom," he said to Imani, "could you please buckle your seatbelt?" Imani reached for the belt, pulled it across her chest, and clicked it firmly into the buckle. The light on the dashboard, however, remained on, still beeping periodically. She unbuckled it and clicked it in again, pushing down hard to make sure it was secure. The light stayed on. A cold silence fell over the car's interior. Carolyn Peterson slowly turned her head and stared at Imani, her thin lips pressing into a grim line. Her eyes, which had been dismissive before, were now filled with active suspicion. "What did you do to it?" she asked, her voice low and accusatory. Imani blinked, completely bewildered. "What? I didn't do anything. I just buckled it. It must be a faulty sensor or something." A faulty sensor? On a brand new $120,000 automobile? Carolyn scoffed, her voice rising. "I don't think so. You were fidgeting around. I saw you. You've broken it." "No, I really didn't," Imani insisted, her heart starting to beat faster. The excitement of being in the fancy car had evaporated, replaced by a creeping dread. "I just sat here. You saw me. I saw you squirming around in a seat you could never afford in a car you have no business being in." Carolyn snapped her veneer of civility, cracking to reveal something ugly underneath. "You've deliberately tampered with the safety equipment. Are you trying to set the dealership up for a lawsuit? Is that the game?" Greg, seeing a massive sale slipping through his fingers, went into panic mode. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm sure it's just a glitch. Let me get a technician." "Don't bother," Carolyn said, her voice like ice. She got out of the car and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Imani. "I want her name. I want her information. This is willful destruction of property. I want to press charges." The scene was escalating with terrifying speed. The dealership manager, a harried-looking man named Mr. Davies, rushed over, drawn by the commotion. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Peterson?" he asked, wringing his hands. "The problem," Carolyn announced for all to hear, "is that this girl has vandalized your vehicle. She's broken the seatbelt mechanism, a critical safety feature. My husband and I are your best customers, Mr. Davies. What are you going to do about this?" All eyes in the showroom were now on Imani. She felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. She was being accused of something ridiculous, something she hadn't done, and no one was listening to her. They saw her hoodie, her jeans, her skin, and they had already reached their verdict. "Mom, I assure you I did nothing," Imani said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a mistake." Mr. Davies looked from Carolyn's furious face to Imani's distressed one and made a swift, cowardly calculation. He chose to placate the money. "Young lady," he said to Imani, his tone condescending and severe, "we take accusations of this nature very seriously. I'm going to need to see some identification, and I suggest you don't leave the premises." Imani felt a wave of cold panic. They were treating her like a criminal. Her mind raced. She knew she needed help. She needed the one person in the world who would never doubt her, the one person who could cut through nonsense with surgical precision. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone. "I need to call my mum," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Carolyn let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, wonderful. Call your mother. Maybe she can afford to pay for the damages." Imani ignored her, her thumb hovering over the contact labeled Mom. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The phone rang twice before her mother picked up. "Imani, honey, is everything okay? I thought you were just looking." "Mum," Imani whispered, trying to keep her voice steady but failing. "Something's happened. I'm at the car dealership Prestige Motors." Dr. Lena Washington's tone shifted instantly from maternal warmth to focused concern. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt, but They're accusing me of breaking a car, a seatbelt. This woman, she's saying I tampered with it, and the manager is treating me like a criminal. He wants my ID. They won't let me leave." She could feel the tears welling up, hot and embarrassing. "Mum, I didn't do anything." "Okay, Imani. Listen to me." Aaliyah said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm of panic. "Don't say another word to them. Don't give them your ID. Don't argue. Just tell them your mother is on her way and that she will handle it. Do you understand?" "Yes." Imani breathed, feeling a small measure of relief. "I'm 10 minutes away. I'm coming. Stay right where you are and stay calm. I love you." "Love you too," Imani mumbled and hung up. She looked up at the 3 pairs of eyes staring at her, Carolyn's filled with smug vindication, Greg's filled with anxious regret, and Mr. Davies's filled with impatient authority. "My mother is on her way," Imani stated, her voice a little stronger now. "She said not to give you anything until she gets here." Mr. Davies bristled. "This is not a negotiation, young lady. You are on private property, and you have been accused of causing significant damage. If you refuse to cooperate, I will have no choice but to call the police." "Go right ahead," Imani said, surprising herself with her own fortitude. Her mother's confidence was contagious even over the phone. Carolyn scoffed. "The police, excellent idea, Mr. Davies. A background check might be very illuminating. People like this often have a history." The insult, so casual and venomous, struck Imani harder than a physical blow. "People like what?" She shot back, her anger finally boiling over her fear. "People who don't look like you. People who don't drive cars that cost more than a house." Now, let's not make this about something it isn't," Carolyn said with a patronizing smirk. "This is about accountability, a concept you might not be familiar with." The next 10 minutes were the longest of Imani's life. She stood in a tense, silent tableau in the middle of the showroom, feeling like an exhibit. Other customers gave them a wide berth, whispering amongst themselves. Greg the salesman had retreated to his desk, looking pale. Mr. Davies stood with his arms crossed, tapping his foot, while Carolyn sat in a plush leather armchair, scrolling through her phone as if the matter was already settled, and she was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. Imani focused on her breathing, just as her mum had taught her to do when she felt overwhelmed. In for 4 hold, for 7 out for 8. She repeated the mantra in her head, trying to block out the humiliating stares and Carolyn's palpable aura of triumph. Just as Mr. Davies was pulling out his phone, presumably to make good on his threat to call the police, the glass doors of the dealership swished open. A woman entered. She wasn't dressed in a power suit or a uniform. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue blazer, charcoal grey slacks, and practical low-heeled shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a neat professional bun, and she wore minimalist jewelry. She carried a leather satchel, and her expression was one of complete, unshakable calm. She looked like a professor, or maybe a lawyer. Her eyes scanned the room instantly, finding her daughter. "Imani," she said, her voice even and clear. She walked directly to Imani's side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" Imani simply nodded the relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees. Lena Washington turned her gaze to the manager. "I'm Lena Washington, Imani's mother. Perhaps you can explain to me why my daughter is being detained." Mr. Davies, momentarily thrown off by her poised demeanor, puffed out his chest. "Ma'am, your daughter has been accused of damaging a very expensive vehicle. Mrs. Peterson here," he gestured to Carolyn, "was a witness." Carolyn stood up, sensing a shift in the dynamic and wanting to reassert her dominance. "I wasn't just a witness. I was the one who caught her. Your daughter deliberately broke the seatbelt mechanism on that sedan. It's a clear act of vandalism." Aaliyah listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at Carolyn. She kept her focus on the manager. My daughter, who is a straight-A student with a full academic scholarship pending, came to your dealership to look at cars and was somehow accused of vandalizing one that seems unlikely. What is the specific nature of the damage? The passenger seatbelt, Mr. Davies said, gaining confidence. It won't register as buckled. She was the last one to touch it. It's an open and shut case. Now we can handle this civilly, which will involve your insurance paying for the full replacement of the system. We're talking several $1,000s, or we can handle it with the police. The choice is yours. Aaliyah absorbed this information without a flicker of emotion. She looked at her daughter, who shook her head silently, a clear, "I didn't do it," in her eyes. Then she looked at the car, and finally, she turned her calm, analytical gaze onto Carolyn Peterson. "You, Aaliyah," said, her voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "You are the one making the accusation." Carolyn bridled at being addressed so directly. "Yes, I am, and I'll be happy to repeat it in a sworn statement to the police." "I see," Aaliyah said. She then turned back to Mr. Davies. "Before you call the police, I suggest you call your service technician. Have him bring a diagnostic tablet and run a check on the passenger occupancy sensor and the buckle's electronic latch. There's a known firmware issue with the B-class restraint control module in this year's model. It frequently causes false positives. It's documented in Technical Service, Bulletin 72-110, Tashampo P 067888A. The showroom fell completely silent. Greg's jaw was literally hanging open. Mr. Davies stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Carolyn let out a nervous laugh. "What are you talking about? Who do you think you are, some kind of mechanic?" Aaliyah ignored her. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice hardening slightly. "You have two options. You can continue to illegally detain my minor daughter based on a baseless, racially motivated accusation from this woman, in which case you will be facing a significant civil lawsuit for false imprisonment and defamation. Or you can call your technician, as I've advised. I suggest you choose wisely." Mr. Davies was sweating now. The sheer specificity of her statement, the technical jargon, the bulletin number had completely dismantled his confidence. This wasn't the kind of parent he was used to dealing with. I suppose we can have our technician take a look," he stammered. "Good," Aaliyah said. "And while we wait, you and I are going to have a discussion about your store's policy for handling customer disputes. And you," she said, finally pinning Carolyn with a piercing stare, "are not going anywhere. You've made a very serious allegation against my child. You will remain here to see it through." Carolyn, for the first time, looked uncertain. The power dynamic she had so carefully constructed had just been obliterated by a calm woman in a blazer who spoke with unnerving authority. The situation was no longer under her control. The technician, a young man named Kevin with grease on his cheek and an air of perpetual bewilderment, was summoned from the noisy depths of the service bay. He arrived with a ruggedized tablet, looking confused as to why the entire sales floor had ground to a halt. "Davies, what's going on?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Kevin, we need you to run a diagnostic on the new S-Class," Mr. Davies said, his voice strained. "The passenger seatbelt sensor?" Kevin shrugged. "Another one." "We just had one in for that last week. The firmware on the restraint module is buggy as heck. It's a 5-minute software patch. You guys got to stop letting customers mess with it before we've done the pre-delivery inspection." He glanced at Imani and her mother, then at the fuming Carolyn Peterson. Did someone report it broken again? The air was thick with unspoken truths. Kevin's casual, unknowing confirmation of Aaliyah's statement was a torpedo to the hull of Carolyn Peterson's story. Carolyn's face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. That's ridiculous. He's just saying that to cover for her." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "Is he? Or is it perhaps the simple technical truth, something you couldn't possibly be bothered with before leveling a life-altering accusation against a child?" Mr. Davies gestured frantically at the car. "Just check it, Kevin. Please." Kevin plugged his tablet into the car's OBD2 port. A few taps on the screen, and a schematic of the car's electronics appeared. He navigated a few menus, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Yep, just like I said. Fault code B1A79, 13. Passenger restraint control module. Open circuit. It's a known software bug. It's not broken. It was never broken. I just need to flash the update." He looked up, finally seeming to grasp the tension in the room. "Why? What did you think happened?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, Carolyn Peterson's accusation lay exposed for what it was, a malicious fiction born of prejudice. She had been so certain, so smug, so ready to ruin a teenager's day or life over a figment of her own bigotry. Mr. Davies looked as if he wanted the polished floor to swallow him whole. He turned to Aaliyah, his face a mask of desperate apology. "Ma'am, Dr. Washington, I am so sorry. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Please accept our deepest apologies." Carolyn, however, was not one to retreat gracefully. Cornered and exposed, she lashed out. "This is a conspiracy. You're all in on it. This is absurd. I am a respected member of this community. My husband is Richard Peterson of Peterson Global Logistics. I will not be made a fool of by her." She spat, gesturing vaguely at Aaliyah. Aaliyah's calm finally began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger that was all the more terrifying for its quietness. "You will not be made a fool of," she repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My daughter, a 17-year-old child, was publicly humiliated, detained against her will, and accused of a crime by you. You didn't seek to understand. You didn't ask for a technician. You leapt to the ugliest possible conclusion because you looked at her and decided she was worthless. You weren't made a fool, Mrs. Peterson. You were one all along. The rest of us just found out." "How dare you?" Carolyn shrieked. "I am the victim here. My new car." "It is not your car." Aaliyah cut in her voice like steel. "And you are not the victim. You are the aggressor. You racially profiled a minor. You attempted to file a false report." "Mr. Davies," she said, turning her attention back to the manager, "you are complicit in this. Your willingness to placate her at the expense of my daughter's civil rights is appalling." Mr. Davies began to babble. "We can make this right. A full apology. Perhaps we can offer Imani a significant discount on a vehicle." "My daughter doesn't want your discount," Aaliyah said icily. "She wants her dignity back, and you can't offer that." She looked at Carolyn, whose face was now a twisted mess of fury and disbelief. "As for you, Mrs. Peterson, you mentioned the police, and your husband." Aaliyah's expression was grim. "You have no idea the trouble you've just invited into your life." Carolyn, emboldened by the mention of her husband's name, and Power made a fatal miscalculation. "Is that a threat? Are you threatening me? I'm calling the police right now and telling them you're harassing me." She fumbled for her phone. "That won't be necessary," Aaliyah said, her voice utterly flat. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a slim black wallet. She flipped it open. She didn't flash it around. She held it steady, presenting it to Mr. Davies, and then turning it slowly so Carolyn could see. Inside, behind a clear plastic window, was not a driver's license or a credit card. It was a gold and blue credential official and unmistakable, bearing her photograph, her name Dr. Lena Washington, and the seal of an eagle clutching an olive branch and arrows. Below it, in bold letters, were the words, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure, Security Agency, Senior Forensic Analyst. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The whispers stopped. Greg the salesman froze mid-sip of his water. Mr. Davies's jaw, which had been flapping uselessly, snapped shut with an audible click. Carolyn Peterson stared at the badge, her eyes wide with shock, and then looked up at Aaliyah's face. The calm, intelligent woman she had dismissed as a nobody, the mother of the girl she had tried to frame, was not just some random citizen. She was a ranking official in the federal government. Aaliyah's voice was devoid of all emotion, as she spoke, the words landing like hammer blows in the silent room. I am a senior analyst for the United States government. My job, Mrs. Peterson, is to find needles in haystacks, to analyze patterns, to uncover truths that people try very hard to hide. You just made the monumental mistake of making yourself your business and your husband my new haystack. She snapped the wallet shut. The sound echoed in the showroom like a gunshot. You wanted to involve the authorities. Aaliyah continued, her gaze unwavering. Congratulations. You have my full attention. The aftermath of the reveal was a study in contrasts. Imani, who had been shrinking under the weight of the accusation, now stood taller, a quiet pride in her eyes, as she watched her mother. Mr. Davies looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of his career float past him. And Carolyn Peterson, for the first time, was utterly silent, her face a frozen mask of horror. The name Richard Peterson was no longer a shield. It was a target she had just painted herself. Aaliyah did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority was absolute, established not by volume, but by the cold, hard reality of the credential she had just put away. Mr. Davies, she began, her tone meticulously professional. I'm going to need the corporate contact information for Prestige Motors' parent company, including the name of your regional vice president and your chief legal counsel. I will also require all CCTV footage from the showroom floor, from the moment my daughter entered the building until this present moment. You will preserve this footage immediately. Is that understood? Yes, of course, Dr. Washington. Immediately. He sputtered, practically tripping over himself to get to his office phone. Aaliyah then turned her attention back to the epicenter of the disaster, Carolyn Peterson. Mrs. Peterson, she said, pulling her phone from her pocket. You stated your husband is Richard Peterson of Peterson Global Logistics. Is that correct? Carolyn could only manage a slight, terrified nod. Aaliyah's thumbs moved with practiced speed across her screen. Peterson Global Logistics, a privately held import-export firm headquartered here in the city, specializes in containerized shipping primarily from Southeast Asia. She looked up from her phone, her eyes boring into Carolyn's. An industry with a significant number of federal regulations, customs declarations, import tariffs, maritime law, labor compliance, a lot of paperwork, a lot of places for discrepancies to hide. This wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the dispassionate air of a scientist describing a specimen under a microscope. He didn't. This has nothing to do with him, Carolyn finally stammered. You made it about him when you used his name as a weapon, Aaliyah replied coolly. You tried to use your perceived status to crush my daughter. Status is a fragile thing, Mrs. Peterson. It relies on a clean reputation. And reputations are built on foundations of truth. I happen to be an expert in examining those foundations for cracks. She wasn't abusing her power. She wasn't logging into a DHS database to run a check on Richard Peterson. She didn't have to. Lena Washington's mind was her greatest weapon. As a forensic analyst, she was trained to see patterns in complex systems, financial records, data streams, supply chains. All she needed was a starting point, a thread to pull, and Carolyn had just handed her the entire spool. "We're leaving," Aaliyah said, putting a protective arm around Imani. She guided her daughter toward the door, pausing as they passed Carolyn. "A word of advice," she said, her voice low enough that only Carolyn could hear. "When you go home tonight, I suggest you tell your husband what you did here today. Tell him everything. Tell him you racially profiled and attempted to frame the daughter of a federal forensic analyst. Because I assure you a day is coming when investigators far more powerful than I am may have questions for him, and it will be better for everyone if he understands exactly why." With that, she and Imani walked out of the dealership, leaving a crater of silent chaos in their wake. The moment they were in Aaliyah's own sensible, impeccably maintained sedan, Imani finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding for an hour. "Mom, that was... wow. You were amazing." Aaliyah's stern demeanor softened as she looked at her daughter. She reached over and squeezed her hand. "Are you okay, baby? That's all that matters." "I am now," Imani said. "But what you said in there, about that bulletin number, the firmware, did you really know that?" Aaliyah smiled faintly. "My job requires me to understand how complex systems fail. Cars, power grids, financial networks. A faulty sensor in a luxury car isn't so different from a vulnerability in a corporate server. It's all about finding the flaw. And I knew there had to be one because there was no flaw in you." "And what about Mr. Peterson?" Imani asked hesitantly. "Are you really going to investigate him?" Aaliyah put the car in drive, her expression turning serious again. "Imani, it's very important you understand this. I will never use my position or government resources for a personal vendetta. That would make me no better than them. It would be a gross abuse of power." She paused, navigating out of the parking lot. "But as a private citizen, I have a certain expertise. I know what public records to look for. I know how to read a financial statement, a shipping manifest, a corporate filing. All things available to anyone who knows where to look. Mrs. Peterson wanted to bring her husband's business into it. So I will look. And if I find any evidence of wrongdoing, publicly available evidence, then as a private citizen, I have a moral and civic duty to pass that information along to the appropriate regulatory agencies, the SEC, the Department of Labor, the IRS. It's not revenge, Imani, it's accountability." She had made a clear distinction. She wouldn't be Lena Washington, the DHS analyst seeking retribution. She would be Lena Washington, the private citizen and expert, ensuring that those who hide behind wealth and power are held to the same standard as everyone else. Carolyn Peterson had thrown a rock at her daughter, and in doing so had dislodged an avalanche that was now sliding silently and unstoppably toward her own glass house. Lena Washington's version of looking was a masterclass in quiet, meticulous demolition. She didn't need classified databases or government warrants. The public domain was an ocean of information, and she was a deep-sea submersible built to explore its darkest trenches. Her first target was Prestige Motors. That evening, after ensuring Imani was settled and feeling safe, Aaliyah sat at her personal laptop. She drafted a formal, exquisitely detailed letter to the dealership's parent corporation and the state's attorney general. It outlined the events of the day, citing specific times, names, and the relevant technical service bulletin for the vehicle. She described in dispassionate legal terms the unlawful detainment of a minor, the act of public defamation, and the clear pattern of consumer discrimination suggested by the manager's immediate deference to a wealthy white customer over a young black one. She attached a link to a local news investigation from 2 years prior about similar complaints at another of the corporation's dealerships. She wasn't just complaining, she was building a case. Within a week, Mr. Davies was fired. Greg the salesman was placed on probation with mandatory retraining in customer sensitivity. Prestige Motors' parent company issued a formal public apology not just to Imani, but to the community, and announced a company-wide review of their customer service policies. The story, leaked by a disgruntled employee, was picked up by a local news blog under the headline, "Luxury Car Dealership Accused of Racial Profiling by Homeland Security Mom." The reputational damage was immediate and severe, but that was merely the opening act. The main event was Peterson Global Logistics. Aaliyah started where anyone would the company's website. It was a slick corporate affair, boasting of seamless supply chain solutions and ethical global partnerships. She cross-referenced the partners they listed with public databases from human rights and labor watch organizations. One of their primary textile suppliers in Bangladesh had a flag on its record for inconsistent compliance with factory safety standards. It was a small crack. Next, she dove into public import/export records, available through the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's website. It was dense, boring data to most, but to Aaliyah, it was a story waiting to be told. She analyzed their shipping manifests for the last 5 years. She noticed a pattern. Shipments of finished cotton apparel from that specific Bangladeshi supplier often had a declared weight that was on average 10–15% lower than the industry standard for the declared volume of goods. To a layman, it was meaningless. To a forensic analyst, it was a screaming red flag. Lighter weight could mean a dozen things, but one of them was the use of cheaper, inferior materials, like a cotton poly blend instead of the 100% premium cotton they were likely declaring to both customs and their high-end buyers to avoid higher tariffs and command a higher price. It was a classic case of customs fraud and misrepresentation hiding in plain sight. Then, she pivoted to the financial side. As a privately held company, Peterson Global Logistics didn't have to file public quarterly reports like a company on the stock market. However, they had secured several large government-adjacent contracts over the years to transport materials for federal contractors. These contracts required extensive financial disclosures. Aaliyah filed a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request for those disclosures. It was a slow process, but she was patient. While she waited, she dug into Richard Peterson himself. She found articles in business journals celebrating his aggressive growth strategies. In one interview, he boasted, "We trim the fat. Every ounce of our operation is optimized for efficiency." Aaliyah suspected trimming the fat was a euphemism for cutting corners. She found property records saw the multi-million-dollar homes, the country club memberships. She saw the donations to political campaigns. A picture emerged of a man who had built an empire on a foundation she was increasingly certain was rotten. 3 weeks later, the FOIA documents arrived. They were heavily redacted, but there was enough. She cross-referenced the transportation costs listed in the government contract disclosures with the standard fuel and labor costs for the periods in question. The numbers didn't add up. His company was billing the contractors, and by extension, the government, at a rate that suggested they were using union labor and meeting stringent U.S. trucking regulations. But Aaliyah's research into their domestic shipping partners suggested they frequently used smaller, non-union outfits with spotty safety records to trim the fat. She now had 3 distinct, well-documented threads of potential wrongdoing. 1. Labor human rights, partnering with a supplier flagged for safety violations. 2. Customs fraud, a pattern of underweight declarations on textile imports suggesting tariff evasion. 3. Contract fraud, overbilling on government-related contracts through misrepresentation of operational costs. She compiled her findings into 3 separate, anonymous, and incredibly detailed whistleblower reports. Each report was a masterpiece of forensic analysis filled with manifest numbers, dates, public financial data, and direct quotes from the company's own materials. They contained no speculation, only data, and the logical conclusions one could draw from it. She didn't send them to Homeland Security. She sent the Labor Report to the Department of Labor. She sent the Customs Report to the International Trade Commission and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. She sent the Contract Fraud Report to the Department of Justice's Public Corruption Unit. Then she wiped her personal laptop search history, closed the files, and made her daughter dinner. As far as she was concerned, her civic duty was done. She had simply pointed the relevant authorities toward a very interesting haystack. It was up to them to find the needles. The consequences did not arrive like a lightning bolt, but like a rising tide. It began subtly. 2 months after the incident at the dealership, a small article appeared in the financial section of the city's newspaper, Peterson Global Logistics Under Review, by ITC for irregularities in import declarations. For Richard Peterson, this was the first sign of trouble. He likely dismissed it as a bureaucratic headache. But then the Department of Labor launched an official inquiry into his company's overseas supply chain ethics, citing anonymous but highly credible tips. The high-end apparel companies that were his clients, pathologically allergic to any hint of sweatshop labor, began to pause their contracts pending the investigation. The real blow came a month later. Agents from the Department of Justice visited his gleaming corporate headquarters. They weren't there for a friendly chat. They presented him with a subpoena for all financial records communications and logistical data related to his work with federal contractors. The contract fraud investigation had begun. The story broke wide. Local CEO Richard Peterson's firm, probed for defrauding U.S. government, screamed the headlines. The articles made sure to include a fascinating bit of context sourced from the earlier news blog post that the initial scrutiny on the Peterson family began after Richard's wife, Carolyn, had falsely accused a black teenager of vandalism in a now infamous incident at a luxury car dealership. Carolyn Peterson's world collapsed. The woman who had built her identity on status on being Mrs. Richard Peterson was now the catalyst for his destruction. Her friends from the charity boards stopped returning her calls. Her invitations to galas and fundraisers mysteriously dried up. She became a social pariah, the woman whose casual racism had brought a federal investigation down upon her own house. The whispers that followed her in the grocery store were no longer about her wealth, but about her spectacular, self-inflicted downfall. For Richard, the unraveling was total. The converging investigations choked his company's cash flow. Clients fled in droves. His assets were frozen. He was buried in legal fees. The efficiency he had boasted about was exposed as a complex web of fraud and deceit. The empire he had built on trimming the fat was collapsing under the weight of his own hubris. 6 months after that fateful day in the showroom, Aliyah and Imani Washington pulled up to a different, more modest dealership. They were there to pick up Imani's birthday car, a certified pre-owned, famously reliable Japanese sedan. It was safe, practical, and all hers. As Imani signed the final papers, her hand steady and confident, she looked over at her mother, who was watching her with a warm, proud smile. "You know," Imani said, as they walked out to the new car, the keys jingling in her hand. "I almost feel sorry for them." Aliyah considered this for a moment. "I understand that, honey. It's good that you have empathy." But don't confuse pity with a lack of justice. They built their lives on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice. All it took was a small, firm push in the right place for the whole thing to fall down. They did this to themselves. She handed Imani the keys. What happened at that dealership was ugly, but I want you to remember what came out of it. You were brave. You stood your ground. You learned that one person armed with the truth and the knowledge of how to use it is more powerful than any bully. Imani looked at the keys in her palm, then at her mother's calm, strong face. She understood. The real power wasn't in a badge or a title. It was in the quiet, unshakable integrity that her mother embodied. It was the power of knowing your worth, even when the world tried to tell you that you had none. It was a lesson far more valuable than any car. She smiled, a genuine, happy smile. "Come on, Mum, let's go for a drive." A year had passed. The heat of the late August sun streamed through Imani's bedroom window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was a chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes, half-filled suitcases, and piles of clothes. In 1 week, she would be leaving for Pratt Institute in New York, her scholarship secure her future, stretching before her like an unpainted canvas. Propped against her desk was the centerpiece of the portfolio that had earned her a spot at one of the best art schools in the country. It was a large, mixed-media piece, dark and turbulent, yet shot through with defiant streaks of gold and brilliant blue. At its center was a fractured, stylized seatbelt buckle from which grew not straps, but powerful wing-like shapes. She had titled it Restraint and Release. The piece was her silent testament, the transformation of a moment of deep humiliation into a declaration of strength. The incident at Prestige Motors was no longer a raw wound. It was a scar that had taught her the topography of her own resilience. Her mother Aliyah stood in the doorway, a laundry basket of freshly folded towels in her arms. "You're going to need more than 3 hoodies for a New York winter, you know," she said, her voice laced with the familiar blend of pragmatism and affection. Imani laughed, turning from the chaos of her packing. "I'll buy a proper coat when I get there. I need to save suitcase space for my supplies." "All right, artist." Aliyah smiled. "I'm running to the pharmacy to pick up your prescription refills before the insurance changes over. Need anything?" "Actually, yeah," Imani said, grabbing her purse. "I'm almost out of charcoal fixative. I'll come with you. I can run into the art shop next door." The trip was mundane, a simple errand on a sun-drenched afternoon. Aliyah went into the pharmacy, while Imani walked to the art supply store. It wasn't a trendy downtown boutique. It was a practical sprawling shop in a strip mall, the kind frequented by students and hobbyists. As Imani browsed the aisles, looking for the specific brand of spray she liked, she heard a voice that sent a jolt of unpleasant recognition through her. It was thin, reedy, and stripped of its former arrogance, but unmistakable. "No, I don't have the rewards card," the voice said, laced with irritation. "Just ring it up." Imani peered through a gap in a display of watercolor pads. Standing at the checkout counter was a woman she barely recognized, yet knew intimately. It was Carolyn Peterson. The transformation was shocking. The perfectly coiffed blonde hair was now a dull, lifeless gray, pulled back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. The silk scarf and designer loafers were gone, replaced by a faded trench coat that was too warm for the weather and worn-down sneakers. Her face was gaunt, etched with lines of stress and resentment. She was buying a cheap set of acrylic paints and a single small canvas, the kind a beginner might buy. There was no aura of power, no condescending smirk. There was just a tired, bitter-looking woman. As Carolyn turned from the counter, her purchase in a plastic bag, her eyes swept the aisle and met Imani's. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Recognition dawned in Carolyn's eyes, followed by a rapid, cascading series of emotions. Shock, then, a flicker of her old venomous anger, and finally a wave of raw, undiluted shame. Her face crumpled. Her eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape route. She clutched her small bag to her chest, like a shield turned abruptly, and practically fled from the store, her footsteps hurried and loud in the quiet space. Imani stood frozen, her can of fixative clutched in her hand. She hadn't felt anger or triumph. Instead, a profound and unsettling pity washed over her. She had seen a ghost, the ghost of a life that had been incinerated by its own arrogance. When she got back into the car, Aliyah took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. "Imani, what is it?" "I saw her," Imani said, her voice quiet. "Carolyn Peterson, in the art store." She described the encounter, the changed appearance, the cheap paints, the look of pure shame on Carolyn's face before she ran. "She looked broken, Mum." Aliyah listened, her expression thoughtful. She started the car, but didn't pull out of the parking spot. "The legal proceedings finished about 2 months ago," she said, gently deciding it was time for Imani to know the full story. Richard Peterson avoided prison time. He cooperated fully with the DOJ, gave them everything on his partners and competitors. He was fined into oblivion, barred from the logistics industry for life, and has to perform 1,000 hours of community service. They lost everything, the houses, the cars, the club memberships. Last I heard, they live in a 2-bedroom rental condo over by the interstate. "So that's it? They're just done?" Imani asked. "Their old life is done," Aliyah corrected. "They still have a life. It's just one without the insulation of wealth and status. It's the life of regular people with regular struggles. For someone like Carolyn, who built her entire identity on being superior to others, I imagine that feels like a fate worse than prison." They sat in silence for a moment, the car's air conditioning humming. "She was buying paints," Imani said almost to herself. "It was so strange." "Maybe she's trying to find a new way to fill her days," Aliyah mused. "Or maybe she's just bored. It doesn't matter, Imani. Her journey is her own now. What matters is what you took from that moment." Imani looked at her mother, her expression clearing. "I felt sorry for her. I thought I would feel powerful or happy if I ever saw her again. But I just felt sad. Sad that she wasted so much of her life on being hateful, that she had nothing left when her money was gone. And that," Aliyah said, her voice full of pride, "is why you won. Not because of what happened to them, but because of who you are. You took an ugly experience, and you created something beautiful and strong out of it. You found your power not in tearing someone else down, but in building yourself up. You turned poison into paint." Aliyah finally pulled the car out of the parking lot, heading home. The conversation shifted back to packing to New York, to the future. The ghost of Carolyn Peterson receded, becoming what she was, a footnote in Imani's story, not the main character. Later that evening, as Imani carefully wrapped Restraint and Release in bubble wrap and placed it in a special art portfolio for the trip, she thought about the woman in the faded trench coat. She hoped with a sincerity that surprised her that Carolyn Peterson would find something to do with those cheap paints. Not for Carolyn's sake, but for her own. Because she understood the lesson her mother had taught her in its entirety. A life spent consumed by hate leaves, no room for art, no room for beauty, and no room for new beginnings. Imani's own new beginning was packed and ready to go. And as she looked around her room at the empty spaces on the walls and the boxes waiting by the door, she felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet, expansive freedom. she was released. That's the story of how a single hateful sentence in a car dealership led to the complete dismantling of a corporate empire. It's a powerful reminder that the world has a funny way of balancing the scales. The actions of Carolyn Peterson, fueled by prejudice, set off a chain reaction she could never have predicted, all because she underestimated the quiet strength and formidable intellect of Lena Washington. This story isn't just about payback. It's about the profound truth that integrity, knowledge, and a mother's love are forces far more powerful than wealth and bigotry. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength can move mountains. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice and accountability. What did you think of our Leah's methods? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.